Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us. In today's segment of R3C Live, we will be discussing the impact that optimizing executive behavioral health can have in helping to propel performance, culture, brand, and competitive advantage. I am your host, Jamie Gassman, Director of Marketing for R3 Continuum. And with us today to shed some expertise on this topic are industry experts, Dr. George Frigolius, Medical Director at R3 Continuum.
Hello, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Manda Rosowski, Clinical Director, Executive Optimization at R3 Continuum.
Hi, everyone. I'm excited to be a part of this conversation.
And Linda Segu, Co-Founder at Experience Happiness.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
Welcome to our expert panel, and thank you for being a part of our discussion today and sharing your expertise. Just like on all of our R3C Live episodes, we are interested in your questions, so feel free to submit them at any time during this presentation through the Q&A widget at the bottom of your screen. We will be addressing all of the questions that we receive at the end. Additionally, with this widget, it can be used if you're experiencing any technical issues with audio or visuals, and our production team will be able to assist you and get you up on speed. So with that, by nature of their jobs, executives shoulder enormous responsibility and are expected to consistently inspire performance in others and achieve it themselves. But they are human, and when personal challenges such as family or marital concerns, chronic stress or burnout, career transitions, and even addiction and substance use occur, the impact is multifaceted and capable of eroding personal, professional, and organizational well-being and performance. So today, we are going to explore these challenges, how they can have an impact on executive behavioral health, well-being, and ultimately performance. So, expert panel, you're all in the field of workplace behavioral health, well-being, and performance. How do these things connect, and what are some of the trends that you're seeing?
Jamie, I'd love to weigh in. This is Linda. As you all know, out there in the audience, if you've been reading anything relative to business, well-being or wellness, you know that well-being is the new black. We're making and have made and are continuing to make this incredible shift from wellness to well-being. And it's literally changing every focus of the experience. So for example, the focus, whereas it used to be primarily physical, it's now a holistic view of well-being, one that includes physical, emotional, behavioral, and even spiritual health. The responsibility now no longer rests with the individual. This is a collaborative effort across the organization. And the offerings are really going beyond sort of these voluntary programs to things that are more integrated and actually become embedded into cultural strategy. Measurement is no longer just about enrollment. It is about performance, and it is about really measuring key performance indicators such as productivity. And the ownership, you know, the good news for those of you who are working in HR is that it's no longer siloed in HR. Again, this is a collaborative effort, and thankfully the C-suite is involved in it because the return on behavioral health and well-being is so tremendous. And finally, the motivation. You know, it's no longer just about health and productivity. It really ultimately is about performance and human optimization, not only professionally, but personally.
Thank you, Linda. I think also that there's a number of key shifts that we're seeing as a result of that trend. And the first one is that employers are really beginning to recognize that link between well-being and performance. And I think they're making that shift from wellness to well-being, not only because it's the right thing to do, but because they now have actual data that supports that it actually propels individual and business performance. The truth of the matter is that companies that are investing in behavioral health initiatives are making more money than their competitors that don't. So much so, there was a recent study out of Deloitte, and they were looking at the annual ROI on behavioral health programming. And what they found was that for every dollar that was invested, the return on that investment was $1.62 by the third year and just increased over time. So what we're seeing is that now 92% of employers are considering well-being part of their overall business strategy. And I think it's particularly relevant to the executive population because what we know to be true is that they experience work-related stress at a rate that's about 50% higher than the general population. And that stress tends to be magnified because they're also trying to negotiate maintaining their interpersonal relationships on top of everything else, which really makes optimizing behavioral health more important than ever.
So you mentioned mounting executive leadership stress and increased work demands driving the need to improve behavioral health. What do you mean by behavioral health, and why is it important for executives?
Thanks, Jamie. And I'm happy to kind of add in my contribution as well. When we think of behavioral health, in its simplest terms, it's really a state of psychological or mental well-being. And when I think of that, I think of it, if you think of like a plant or a tree or a flower, you can give it water, you can give it sun, but it needs the right soil conditions in order to grow. And when you think about behavioral health where it is not well adjusted, not well managed, the soil in which one's overall functioning is occurring creates additional problems, and it really hinders their ability to thrive and survive and produce well in all facets of their life. When someone has good behavioral health, they basically have the sufficient and necessary coping mechanisms to navigate through life's trajectories, difficulties, day-to-day dilemmas in a way that allows them to build on those, learn from those, and continue to move forward in a way that promotes their own growth and actually promotes the growth of others as well. So, and the key in the workplace, especially amongst executives, is we're talking about happy, productive, and focused individuals. So cultivating behavioral health in the workplace, it's important because it relates to so many things, both personally and professionally. And if that is not in place, then the soil within which one's resilience is kind of trying to develop and productivity blooms out of is going to be significantly hindered.
Executives are navigating really highly stressful situations on a daily basis. There's a loneliness that comes along with being on top. Senior leadership is isolated by classified knowledge that they have and decision-making responsibility that can't really be shared or delegated. Jamie touched briefly in the introduction on how they can face unique challenges, like being under extreme pressure and scrutiny. They might have chronic stress and burnout. They might have to deal with crazy travel schedules or relocation and making cultural adjustments, and even as far as physical threats to their safety.
And thank you, Amanda. One of the key difficulties or paradoxes that occur when we're talking about executives and their functioning and behavioral health is that the very group or the very group of individuals that an organization looks to be models, right? To be bastions of leadership, stewardship, composure, ethical judgment, guidance, mentoring, all these wonderful things that you want to see in leadership and you want to see in a very good organization. When those are not in place, those factors, those qualities suffer. And what makes it particularly difficult for the C-suite or for executives is that they're also particularly prone to the pitfalls that occur when there's a negative impact of those stresses and other pressures that can occur. So for those predisposed to temptations due to personality variables or factors such as behavioral health, or I should say poorly managed behavioral health, when they're placed in high stress, high production, high demand situations, which most executives are, and that comes with the territory, by the way, being in that role, it creates kind of an ample opportunity and in some cases motive for them to get off track and to struggle in some ways. And there's a number of ways that can occur. One is money, right? Executives have strong incentives as well as strong temptations to try to necessarily abuse or manipulate their roles for financial gain. Power comes with these positions. So things like authority, and freedom from controls, and how is that managed, and how is that negatively impacted by the presence of a behavioral health condition or a series of symptoms. Velocity, right? The need or the pressure to produce quickly or to make quick decisions in real time or game time decisions can be significantly hampered if somebody, let's say, has depression and their thought process is slowed. Competitive personalities are common at this level, and that actually allows individuals at that level to thrive. A little bit of competition is a good thing, but it can also kind of become malignant when you layer on top of that poorly managed behavioral health and a lack of well-being. And then behavioral ethics, of course, comes into play as well. Situational and social influences that can determine moral decision-making, such as conflicts of interest, motivated blindness, irrational loss avoidance. Things like this can occur as well, and further be compounded and exacerbated by the presence of behavioral health issues.
I would like to touch on, Jamie, just keying off of what George was just saying, that, no one is exempt. Execs are human beings. And the personal impact is incredible. Obviously, there's things such as anxiety and depression. We know that CEOs have twice the rate of depression as the rest of the population, which already, unfortunately, averages 20%. And then, we're dealing with an American burnout epidemic, actually a global burnout epidemic in industries such as healthcare, technology, law, you name it. Our burnout levels are looking at about 2/3 of people are suffering burnout on the job. And at the root of burnout, it's not just a mental construct, it actually is a condition. And at its root is complete exhaustion, both emotional and physical, due to repeated exposure to emotionally demanding situations. And executives are in those situations all the time. Burnout is not in your mind. It is a condition that is physical. It is emotional, and it's behavioral. So if you think about the physical things, burnout impairs sleep, for example. It can create frequent fatigue or deep fatigue, crushing fatigue, headaches, body aches. And emotionally, when we work with people on this, we see that there can be incessant worry. There can be a high degree of cynicism. And when it gets really bad, people begin to detach. And you can imagine how that begins to impact relationships with teams at work, with colleagues, and also with relationships at home. In healthcare, this is particularly devastating among physicians who really need to have that connection with patients in order to make proper diagnoses. And they are detaching because they simply are too burned out and they can't do anything about it. Lastly, the behavioral piece is really important to look at. Everything from procrastination, leaving early, coming in late, presenteeism. We're talking about this a lot at work, being there but not being there. And then, of course, there's a tendency with that to turn to either food or substance or alcohol as a coping mechanism. So the impact is insidious, and it shows up not just at work, but it also shows up at home.
I agree with that, Linda. And I think, one thing that I noticed, particularly in the executive population, is that people are really adapting those unhealthy and compulsive behaviors as a way to escape or cope with that elevated level of stress that they're exposed to on a regular basis. And like you said, it can look, sometimes like substance use or addiction, but it can also look like other unhealthy compulsive behaviors, like you said, eating, gambling, excessive spending, compulsive shopping, even pornography or repeated risky sexual behaviors in order to just escape and cope with that stress.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Amanda. I want to build on that. In addition to that, there are a host of mood and cognitive impacts that can occur when somebody is dealing with these things. So, for example, anxiety and depression in particular, we see declines in memory, declines in decision making. We see what we typically refer to in the field as vegetative symptoms, difficulty sleeping or oversleeping, lowered energy, anhedonia, so a lowered feeling of just pleasurable activities, no longer taking enjoyment in the challenge of working with the team or working on an initiative that used to be a driving force for an executive. They just don't have that energy level, that interest level that they used to. And those small adjustments, even at a mild level, can really set somebody back when you're working in a highly driven, pressured situation or amongst peers that are constantly in a highly driven, focused area. And the difficulty with many executives is there's a stigma around behavioral health. There's a fear that might be interpersonal in their relationships. It might be familial in terms of what they were raised to avoid or not admit. But there's also a culture by which if I admit I'm depressed or have severe anxiety or some other condition, how are my peers going to look at me? How is it going to affect my career trajectory? Are people going to look down on me thinking that if they give me a high stress assignment and I need to produce on that they might fear that I'm going to have some kind of mental or emotional breakdown. So these are things that many executives are worried about and concerned about. They also are worried about time management. And this is a double-edged sword because on the one hand, when you have symptoms of anxiety, depression, you might be developing symptoms of bipolar disorder, or even ancillary symptoms related to some of the addictions issues that Amanda was just talking about. Not only does it directly affect your ability to manage time in an efficient and an effective manner, but it also decreases or rather increases your anxiety that you don't have enough time to do things as well. So it kind of hits you in both directions. And then lastly is decision making. What we find time and again with many of these behavioral health disorders when they're poorly managed is decisions aren't as sharp. They're not as inclusive of all the intel or the data points that are needed to make an informed decision. And that further erodes productivity, it erodes communication, and it erodes teamwork as a negative impact on the overall work culture.
Great. So we have a polling question that we want to hear from the audience. So when you look at this list of personal impacts examples, which of these are you seeing in your organizations? So you should see that on your screen if you can go ahead and click and submit the impact that you're seeing most commonly on at your organization. I'll give you about 30 seconds to do that, and then we'll show the results of what we are seeing. Okay, so I think we've given enough time. I'm going to go ahead and push what results we found. So looking at these, it looks like burnout is 50% along with loss of motivation. And several of you mentioning that all of the above is showing up within your organization. So thank you for participating in that. That was very interesting to see real life examples from the audience, what you're experiencing in the workplace. So now I want to shift it to looking at the organizational impact. So when a leader's behavioral health is neglected, what is the impact on the organization?
I'd like to speak into that, Jamie, if you'd allow me to. George was mentioning all of these signs and symptoms, be it depression, anxiety, compulsive behavior, burnout. All these things impair judgment and decision-making. And what happens is when we have a leader who is experiencing these unfortunate signs and symptoms, it can trickle down into the organization. There's actually research done on this, and it shows that a leader who is not feeling fully capable in the moment can unintentionally, it's not your fault, but unintentionally erode trust, erode morale, productivity, culture, and even performance. If you look at Elon Musk, for example, when he had a Twitter moment this last year, saying that he was going to take his company back private, that he had the funding, and it caused a dramatic dip in stock price, and you can imagine what that did for Tesla culture. Fortunately, they seem to be bouncing back quite well. So the reality to keep in mind is that high-performing organizations need high-performing, happy leaders who are feeling capable and healthy on every level. Whereas in the past, a lot of our efforts focused, and they were good efforts. They focused on fitness. They focused on executive physical health. The investment in executive behavioral health just makes sense because they're human just like the rest of us. And at the end of the day, something to consider is that taking care of your leaders is just good business, because their presence and their reach and their capability is needed in the organization. And really, behavioral health and well-being really does start at the top. So we need leadership modeling those behaviors and really taking good care of themselves, because one of my favorite phrases is, you can't pour from an empty cup. We need to start emphasizing self-care and teaching people how to do so with evidence-based tools and practices and programs and solutions.
Okay, thank you, Linda. It's interesting what Linda was talking about just a second ago. There's a commercial. It's not that old, but I haven't seen it in a few months. But it's I think it's Lincoln Town Cars, and it's Matthew McConaughey, and he's driving. And for all the women, I'm sure you will not mind a Matthew McConaughey reference. And he says, taking care of yourself is about much more than just taking care of yourself. And of course, they're selling cars, but the truth is, and one thing that Linda is kind of tapping into, is how we manage ourselves has a ripple effect on other people in our life. And it not only affects negatively, right? If we're not managing well, it could bring added stress and can bring others down, but it also negatively impacts positive growth and developments. So what we see is innovation and growth potential gets stunted when these things are negatively impacted. Earlier, I talked about anxiety and depression and the prevalence of those in the workplace. And when those are shut down, creativity becomes shut down. And the difficulty is that innovation requires creativity. And creativity only occurs when somebody is feeling both competent, but also confident to take risks. Because if somebody doesn't take risks, they're not going to stretch. They're not going to break that old barrier of the old ways of thinking. And so you don't have innovation. And that's what happens in companies where they have cultures that are kind of falling down to this, and they're not continuing to thrive and develop and cultivate cultures of well-being. So if a team is hesitant in terms of teamwork, to share ideas, to take risks, to be open with one another, innovation is curtailed and growth just doesn't happen. It's negatively impacted, and there's really no way around it. Another thing to be mindful of is trust and brand reputation are also negatively impacted. In terms of brand reputation, talent acquisition is negatively impacted, not only by the culture, but by if there's negative events that are shared in the media or in the public eye, that affects people in terms of choosing, do I want to go work there? Do I want to be part of that environment? And we are seeing this more and more with Gen Xers and Gen Z groups coming up. They want money, they want a lot of things, but they also want to feel they're part of a culture that's bigger than themselves and really doing something positive in promoting well-being. So developing the right culture through well-being, right? Through developing trust, cultures of innovation, where risk-taking is welcomed and appreciated, that allows people to attract and retain top talent. And that becomes kind of a spin wheel that continues to attract more good talent as you go forward. Now, there's a flip side, right? There's a downside to that, and that is And we've seen the downside in recent years, right? We've seen record high rates of executives that are coming under major scrutiny for a range of behaviors of concern, be them sexual misconduct, fraud, other types of brand damaging behaviors, bullying, in some cases, domestic violence, violence in the workplace, going on tirades, sometimes fueled by narcissism or anger discontrol, other times fueled by primary mental illness like bipolar disorder. But we've seen the negative impact. And in some cases, organizations have literally gone under because of these very, very damaging but high profile and highly disruptive events that have occurred. And so it's really important to be mindful of that as we continue to dialogue today.
So these are tough issues that you guys are all addressing today. So what stands in an executive way of getting support?
Well, I think, Jamie, first of all, there's a lot of misinformation out there. So hopefully today we can sort of speak to some of that and get at what the truth of the matter really is. And I think a lot of people make the assumption that executives make a lot of money, and because they can afford it, they're getting the help they need. But I think in reality, at least in my experience working with executives, is that there are actually a variety of barriers that get in the way sometimes of them getting the support that they need. And that can be things like heavy travel schedules, their demanding workload, they don't think they have the time, as George mentioned earlier, but also that fear of being perceived as weak, and also not really knowing who they can trust or where they should turn when they do need support.
I would like to add on, sort of as the the burnout maven, that, so many times, and I've heard this with people who, from trauma physicians to CEOs, that they think the burnout is in their head. And if you're paying attention to the World Health Organization in the last year, burnout is actually now a condition, and it is not something that you've made up. And it's not something that, this notion of, a vacation will fix it. A couple days off will fix it. It's a real condition that is multifaceted and insidious, and it needs more than just a vacation to not only mitigate it, but prevent relapse. And the good news is that there are tools out there. There are tools, once you learn them, once you integrate it into your life, you can not only lower your burnout dramatically, but you can dramatically increase, your well-being, your happiness, your effectiveness. And the good news is you can also prevent relapse. We need tools for prevention just as much as we need tools for mitigation.
Thanks, Linda. That is a key point. And it reminds me of a saying I sometimes train to in a slightly different space, what I call the opposite of well-being, workplace violence. And that is, and I'm going to say something that I think is going to apply to everybody listening today. And I don't say that lightly because those are tough claims to make. But it's this: every time you said that you couldn't go on, you did. Because if you didn't, you wouldn't be here listening right now. You'd be some other plane, right? And you wouldn't be alive. But the truth is that when we think of leadership roles, and sometimes when we think of leaders, and certainly when we work with leaders, there's kind of a myth that leaders cannot effectively lead while also addressing behavioral health issues or other stressors that are going on. And that is a myth. That's just not true, because that's what we all do. We all, some of us do it better than others. Some of us do it better at certain points of our life than others. But the truth is, we're all carrying those loads and managing them as we're continuing to move through our days and lead our teams, or in our personal lives, parent our children, or coach the soccer team, or do whatever else we need to do. So in reality, executives can simultaneously optimize their behavioral health and lead effectively. It's not an either-or proposition. In fact, when executives fail to look at these issues, if they ignore them, they duck their head in the sand, major cultural implications result, such as absenteeism begins to creep up. There's low morale. We see decreased engagement in the workplace in initiatives in supporting the larger brand. And we certainly see decreased team performance. And all of these things are issues that can occur when we live in the myth that we can't simultaneously manage these issues while also continuing to perform and work.
I think similarly to George, there is that belief that executives don't need organizational support relative to taking care of their behavioral health. But we see every day in our work that when organizations are helping executives connect to confidential behavioral health support, they're also helping those executives thrive, which in turn promotes business performance and also really starts to build those cultures of well-being overall.
I completely agree, Amanda. One of the reasons why I got so interested in this space about 16 years ago is because I myself was experiencing burnout. I had spent a decade working on Wall Street, and I didn't know what was wrong with me. And I had this, crushing fatigue, all of these symptoms. My relationships weren't functioning either at home or at work. And, at the time, I think I can just speak to this personally, I felt really isolated with this. I didn't know who to talk to. I was buried under self-help books. You were going to find me perishing under, a stack of positive psychology. And finally, when I realized, oh my goodness, this is what this is, and I could begin to talk about it and get help for it, like other executives, I was less inclined to hide my struggle and to actually talk about it and get real professional evidence-based help, because my burnout didn't make me a failure. My chronic stress didn't make me a bad person. But I needed to pay attention to what was in front of me and deal with it, because at the time I had a very young son and I wanted to be a better parent. I wanted to be a better leader. I wanted to be a better friend. I wanted to be a better partner. So there were a lot of things motivating me at the time. And I think, those motivations are there for all of us. And it's just incumbent upon us to have compassion and to provide the support that is required, and to not judge. This no stigma thing, it's really important. And again, I just say it over and over, none of us are exempt. And things like burnout and chronic stress, they're not just from work exclusively. They might be from, those of us who are in the sandwich generation, taking care of aging parents or someone with a chronic illness, and then also having school-aged children. It's remarkable, the day-to-day stressors that we're dealing with as human beings. And then we have this 24-hour news cycle. So all of you out there in the audience, for whatever reason you came here for this discussion, please have compassion for yourselves. You're not alone with this. And you're not imagining that, it's an intense world. Work is intense, family is intense, it's intense. There's a lot of adulting.
So much adulting. I think in addition to, the myths that we've been touching on, again, we'll mention that there is that fear that vulnerability equates to weakness, and their roles are already isolating, like you were saying. Another barrier, though, that I have observed is that traditional channels of support do what they do and they do it well, but unfortunately, they're not always equipped to manage ongoing executive optimization. Sometimes they simply don't have the subject matter experts that are able to address those unique challenges that executives at this level face on an ongoing basis. And the breadth and tailoring of those services to meet those unique needs isn't readily available.
Mm-hmm.
So in carrying on from that, Amanda, how can an organization remove those barriers to help people and ultimately propel that better performance?
Well, I think first of all, it's really important to start talking about behavioral health and removing that stigma. Despite the fact that over 200 million workdays are lost every year as a result of behavioral health issues, and it costs somewhere around, I think, $16.8 billion in lost productivity, behavioral health remains a taboo subject. I read somewhere that 60% of people have never talked about their behavioral health status to anyone that they work with. Mm-hmm. And I would venture to guess that that number is probably far higher in the executive population. So we need to really start talking about it and remove that stigma.
Absolutely, Amanda. Those are great points. You know, there's some recent research that shows that 50% of employees feel that behavioral health, less than 50% feel that behavioral health is prioritized at their workplace. And then fewer than that feel that their company leaders, right? Those that are the executives and the leadership, are prioritizing that and are advocates of well-being in the company or in the culture. And the difficulty is in those same cultures, workers report that they don't trust supervisors enough to reveal the vulnerabilities or the difficulties that they're having. They may not trust to bring those forward and engage EAP or other counseling-based services, all again because of the stigma, the fear of that stigma and the negative judgment on themselves and maybe even on their career path or their career trajectory. They fear that peers or bosses will treat them differently. These are real realities that people are dealing with. Another interesting statistic is 86% of employees feel that their culture, their organizational culture, should support behavioral health. But again, as I said a minute ago, less than 50% feel that they do. That's a big discrepancy. It's a big problem. So when we talk about behavioral health, it really is kind of the next frontier in terms of inclusion, diversity, building cultures of equity, and essentially building cultures of resilience and thriving. And that not only helps the individual, it helps the team, it helps the bottom line. It has a multi-generational and multi-programmatic impact over time. One of the big things we see is time and time again, managers or supervisors will say, I just don't have time to deal with this kind of stuff. And what we often say, you know, Amanda, Linda, and myself will often say, you don't have time not to deal with it because you're going to pay one way or the other. If you don't get out ahead of this and promote cultures of well-being and deal with those barriers that we're all talking about, you're going to be dealing with kind of cleaning it up on the back end. And that is a much more difficult lift over time and can be really, really negatively impactful.
Absolutely, George. I was in a conversation recently where there was a group of C-suite leaders, and it was so impressive. They saw the link that we needed to talk about and address behavioral health in order to create a culture of inclusion, well-being, and safety. So think about this. If you've got people who are not enjoying or attending to, their behavioral health, enjoying solid behavioral health, it impacts inclusion, overall well-being, and safety. And if you're following the news cycle, we need all of those things in order to cultivate thriving companies and thriving communities. So this natural shift is really important. As Amanda, as you were saying, it's important to be aware that not all regular channels, HR departments, perhaps EAPs, are equipped for the nuances of this, especially with these ongoing issues. And policy changes aren't enough. As I mentioned earlier, we need to make these programs and solutions and practices, we need to make them very transparent and available to people, and then allow them confidential access so that they can feel safe and comfortable, and they can do their work while they continue to do their work, if that makes sense. And it's very interesting. There was a recent study that showed that a full 80% of executive leaders feel that they would benefit from a coach to help them manage their stress. It's time to start listening.
Right. Well, like you said, it really is about making that commitment to build a culture of well-being. It's essential, and it really has to start at the top. And that means your organization's executives living it and promoting it, really modeling disclosure and vulnerability as strengths rather than weaknesses. And I think it's also really important to have visible programming that attends to executive behavioral health and performance. Mm-hmm. It really trickles down from the top.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely, Amanda. And some other ways to improve on that or to build that is invest in educating people about awareness of programs and awareness of fostering the openness that Amanda's speaking to, right? Make support available and easily accessible, and make it clear of how people can do that, how they can reach out and get that support. And then promote both traditional channels of support, which may be calling the EAP, for example, as well as develop and promote new initiatives that might fill in the gaps. One thing we do see over time is a number of corporations will have very low utilization rates for available counseling or support services, whether it's a financial difficulty, going through a divorce, dealing with an aging parent, dealing with the chronic illness of a child, whatever it may be. And people aren't accessing this. And companies aren't asking the question, why are people not accessing it? They assume, well, people don't need it. Well, actually, it might be people aren't accessing it because the company has not put into place the kinds of things that Linda, Amanda, and I are talking about in terms of having kind of open access and both traditional and non-traditional ways of accessing that support.
So at this time, we're going to open it up for questions from the audience. And so as a reminder to all of you in the audience, at the bottom of your screens, you should have a widget tool. The one marked with Q&A is, we'll open up a text box for you to be able to submit your questions. We do have a question that has come in from the audience. The question is, I would be interested in your thoughts on how to navigate this conversation with an executive that shows signs of burnout and in that state doesn't have time and feels defensive when you bring up the topic.
I would be happy to speak to that. Amanda, are you comfortable with that?
Yeah. I thought, given you're the burnout guru,
yeah.
Go for it.
Yeah,
Takes one to know one. I think what's really interesting, and I've seen this even with trained physicians, is that most people actually don't recognize the signs and symptoms of burnout. They don't know that it goes beyond exhaustion, cynicism, deep-seated feelings of inefficacy. And it's really helpful for them. It's not about diagnosis, right? It's not about self-diagnosis, but gaining awareness through taking a confidential assessment can be a really powerful place. And, going to an executive and saying, I've been noticing that you have been tired or that you have been sort of short lately. Are you open to taking an assessment? Share your observations and share that you care. You've been under a tremendous amount of stress, maybe for the last couple years. And are you open to taking an assessment? An assessment, again, is not about diagnosis. It's about awareness. It's an instrument to go, oh my goodness, out of 16 signs and symptoms of burnout, I've got 14. And once they understand their signs and symptoms, then they know they're not imagining this. This is very real. And then you can lead them to a program where they can actually get some help and that you can get a measurable result in over a period of months to reduce that burnout. So once you actually understand what's going on, knowledge is power, and that really is the first step. But always, linking it to, I care about you, and you've had a lot going on. Are you open to doing something like this? Are you open to exploring and just self-assessing? I think it's a good place to start.
I would say too, Linda, when there is that hesitance or maybe defensiveness around talking about behavioral health issues, because there is that solid link that's undeniable between well-being and performance, if you often lead with performance and we really get at the issues of where their biggest pain points are there, behavioral health always comes in the back door. Once that rapport is there and solid, they'll open up eventually. At least that's what my experience has been.
My addition to that, thanks, Amanda, is I also, and again, I'm speaking, as the forensic psychologist guy here, but I use this in threat assessment a lot. I find what I refer to as linking nuggets. What are those little connections, those pieces of information that person and I might have in common? In this case, let's say it's sports, right? And then I use that to make the metaphor of, would LeBron or would Serena Williams, if they had an injury, if they pulled a hamstring, would they just keep pushing through, or would they take the time they need to get the proper treatment and the proper assessment in order to get back on the court and be functioning at the highest possible level as soon as possible? And when you reshape the dialogue, when you reshape the narrative, it's no longer a weakness. It's actually a strength to be able to say, I need to go get this dealt with real quickly. I need, whether it's physical therapy or mental therapy, I need to get this fixed so I can get back on the court and be playing at my top performance level. Most executives understand those types of metaphors, and it's about reframing it away from a perception of weakness.
We had another question come in that states, so does R3 promote a specific program approach such as 360 leadership assessment, etc.?
We do have coaches that do traditional 360 assessments as part of our coaching solution. It's one of our offerings, but we have quite a comprehensive range of both consulting and coaching in our program.
And then another question comes in is, what do you see as the best place to start in helping executives both recognize and address their behavioral health issues?
I can take this one. I think it's a collaborative process. I think you really start with the assessment of, let's take a look at the career life cycle of an executive in that particular organization, because there's going to be cultural nuances. An executive experience at one organization can be far different than another. And so you really want to take a look at where the biggest pain points are relative to their well-being and their performance. And then really kind of wrapping programming around those areas that present the largest challenge so that they feel supported in those tough spots. I think that's a good start.
George or Linda, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I'll add in, Jamie, if you don't mind. I love that answer. The other thing I find time and again with executives, and no matter where they fall on the stress level, or I'm even going to say on the narcissistic scale, right? Whatever it is, time and again, executives do take pride in being leaders, in being models for the organization. They don't always do it well, right? Because they're human. We're human. But they do take pride in that. And so I like to try to tap into that. How do they see themselves in the eyes of others as models or stewards? I love the concept of stewardship. In terms of leading, guiding an organization. And then what I'll often do too is I'll flip that. And I will talk with them about mentors they have had. And I will ask them, if your mentor was sitting right next to you today, the empty chair technique from those of us that have done therapy in the years ago, what would they say? How would they advise you here? Because what's amazing is we have wonderful mentors that we can channel very quickly in our memory that would tell us to do something that we won't do for ourselves. And so those are just some ways that I try to just get people to open up and be more open to these handling and reframing these behavioral health issues.
Great. So we have another question that came in, and it says, I would imagine there's a large concern around confidentiality and accessing these types, a type of service around executive behavioral health. So what is your messaging around how to alleviate that concern within the organization or within a particular executive?
Sure, Jamie, and I'll start this one out if you don't mind. And you're right on target with that question and the assumption that there's concerns around this, because there are. They're widespread and they're understandable. Here's the good news. there are a number of measures that we would recommend with client partners that can be implemented with executives so that they can feel safe and comfortable accessing services. One of the key recommendations we have, and there's a number of them, but one of the key ones is to have some kind of an anonymous support network or anonymous support system in which executives can reach out for education, support materials, knowing what options they have towards finding solutions for a given problem, and do it without the fear of some kind of stigma or retribution against them. What this does is it starts the conversation. It gets them engaged into a process where they're taking ownership and accountability of trying to better or improve themselves, deal with whatever issue they're dealing with. It builds trust and it eases that kind of transition in their comfortability in reaching out over time. We're going to speak a little more about this in more depth next month when we take into account some considerations of designing a program that is tailored to specific organizations or to more specific needs. We're going to be talking about that next month in our follow-up episode. So please join us if you're interested in hearing a little bit more about that.
Great. We did have another question that came in. It says, often leadership coaching isn't voluntarily sought, but are compelled or required by higher ups. Do you approach such referrals differently?
I think probably every coach has their own approach, right? I think that no matter what, whether it's voluntary or involuntary, it's collaborative and you have to meet your client where they are. So as long as you have the ability to do that, which I feel confidently that all of our coaches have that ability and that understanding that when you meet your client where they are, you develop a rapport that good things can come out of that. I know in my own personal practice, I had plenty of clients that were mandated for whatever reason. I worked a lot in addiction, and so I had a lot of mandated clients, and it can be tricky. There is a defensiveness that you have to deal with at first, but as long as you can meet them where they are and develop that rapport, then good things can still come of that.
Great. So one more question, final question. In your experience, what constitutes a well-rounded executive optimization program?
I think comprehensive consulting and coaching that is delivered confidentially by industry subject matter experts that have vast experience working in the executive population. And then, unfortunately, we live in times where emotional and physical protection need to be addressed as well. So if you're looking to really develop a comprehensive program, I think it's wise to address that full continuum. I know that when we were putting together our program, those are the things that we considered. We really wanted to provide a comprehensive solution that organizations could leverage as a competitive advantage by supporting their executives when they need it the most, so that they're thriving and really achieving and sustaining that level of performance that's really going to propel business.
And just for the audience, you provided.
Jamie, if I could just add to that real quick. Sorry, I love what Amanda said. I think those are certainly core factors. And she had a great point earlier, right, just a second ago about meeting executives where they are. I think that's important for program development as well. So all those factors that she said are important, but it's also important. And this is one thing Amanda has, I think, done so well at R3. Is had all of those in place with our programs that we've worked with organizations, but also shown some adaptability to fit those into the culture that we're working with, because there are different corporate cultures and they have different pain points and they have different stress points. So having options that can be tailored to those corporations and have some adaptability of how that program fits is key. And she's done that very well.
George, may I add one thing? I also think that it's understanding the schedules and the lifestyles of executives. You know, you are not going to be doing a lot of this work during their busy, intensive hours. Having a team, a force, if you will, that is adaptable to schedules and to lifestyle, and that really understands just how busy these people are. I think it's our role then, once we demonstrate that compassion, demonstrate that understanding and expertise, to help them shift really from kind of human doings to human beings, because that really is the goal. We can be healthy human beings, and we don't have to be in the obsessive doing. Sometimes it's not about doing more. Sometimes it's about taking a step back so that we can re-engage and focus in a healthier, more productive way.